I thank the Speaker, and I appreciate the time to come here in December. Not sure if we'll get time next week here on the floor. And as we look forward to Christmas, I think it's important to remember why we're here and why we're here in the House. Christmas 1777 was one of the lowest and most desperate points of American history. General Washington, fresh off defeats at Brandywine and Germantown, had marched the battered Continental Army to winter quarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Frozen rain, snow, and brutally cold temperatures tested not only the men's resolve to fight for freedom, but their bodies' ability to withstand the elements. They showed up low on provisions. It was so bad that in a letter on December 23rd, General Washington wrote to Henry Lawrence of the Continental Congress that, quote, "I am now convinced beyond a doubt that unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place, this army must inevitably be reduced to one or other of these three things: starve, dissolve, or disperse." This is not an exaggerated picture. Historians estimate that as many as a third of them didn't have boots or shoes. Washington ordered soldiers to build wooden huts for themselves to stave off the cold and to search the surrounding countryside for straw to make bedding to keep them warm. They didn't have enough blankets to go round, after all. In the same letter, Washington also noted that his army was in danger from the enemy. General Howe was nearby, and Washington needed his men ready to rock and roll, but they couldn't do it. Quote, "I ordered the troops to be in readiness for an attack, but behold," Washington wrote, "to my great mortification, the men were unable to stir on account of provision. All I could do under these circumstances was to send out a few light parties to watch and harass the enemy." His officers were resigning, leaving the camp, and he fretted that without congressional action otherwise, quote, I much doubt the practicability of holding the army together much longer." How did we get here? 12 months earlier had been one of the high points of the revolution of Washington's military career. Victories at Trenton, victories at Princeton, crossing of the Delaware, and the daring Christmas Day surprise attack on the Hessians. This year it was burnt mutton and watered-down grog for an army that was cold, starving, and on the brink. 2,500 out of 10,000 would die there from disease and exposure. We know that's not the end of the story. We know that because I'm standing here on this floor in the United States House of Representatives as a citizen of the greatest country in the world. Baron von Steuben got to camp in February of 1778 and started whipping the Continental Army into better shape. And Washington's men kept up the fight until Yorktown 3 long years later. But now, Mr. Speaker, and to my friends and colleagues that are here in the chamber, the few remaining, it's now our turn to fight. We are at a, relatively speaking, low point in our country's history due to the unbelievable, but yet completely observable negligence, nay, I say purposeful actions of the current administration to undermine the safety, security, prosperity, and well-being of our people and our nation. We have millions of people who have been dumped into our country illegally, including criminals. We have $36 trillion in debt, another $2 trillion a year. It's really another $1 trillion every 100 days, little over 3 months. Americans are in record levels of personal debt because of the record levels of inflation and a hamstrung economy by bureaucrats and progressive radical Democrats who want to micromanage your life, regulate your life to death, tell you what stoves you can use, what cars you can drive up the price of your cars, your houses, your schools, your health care, and then thank you for the privilege. The world around us is in chaos. We see what's happening in Syria. We saw what's happening in South Korea. We see what's happening around the globe. Ukraine, Russia, the empowerment of Iran, although thankfully the resolve of Israel standing strong while our country has walked away from that fight. And that's all due to the weakness of the Biden administration that it has shown for 4 years. Now it is our calling in this Congress to stand up alongside President Trump to stand up and fix it. But the calling for our Congress is not to simply walk back some of the failures of this administration. It is not to ask for some quick fixes. It is to fundamentally change the trajectory of our country. It is to take bold action. It is to pass serious legislation. It is to fundamentally change our reliance on debt and profligate spending that is indebting our children and driving up inflation because we're spending money we don't have. We have an obligation to fight for the American people. That is our calling. And as we wrap up this year, and we have several really important fights and debates to continue to finish, whether it's the National Defense Authorization Act, which unbelievably our Democratic colleagues are resisting and saying they're not going to support. Why? Because Republicans have taken the position that we shouldn't have taxpayer funding at the Pentagon for transgender surgeries for children. Our Democrat colleagues are so committed to the mutilation of children that they would choose not to authorize the defense of the United States. That is the world in which we are currently operating, yet it is Republicans who are standing here in defense of our children while trying to make sure our defense is strong. But the NDAA is not where it should be, let me be clear. Because of radical progressive Democrats in the Senate and the House, we have miles to go. We have an obligation to do our job. We have an obligation to not spend money we don't have. We have an obligation to pay for the disaster aid that so many of my colleagues understandably want and seek for their constituents in the wake of hurricane damage or drought or issues that are facing our people. We have an obligation to pay for these things. Else we are no better than the people we criticize. Come January, after we do whatever we're going to do here in December with respect to the funding of government, the disaster funding, the National Defense Bill, Farm Bill, all issues that are still right before us. We have a new president, we have a new Congress coming in, a new Senate, all Republican. What will we do? I'm here to suggest to you that through the reconciliation tools, we can make serious change. Now, here I want to pause for a second. I have colleagues of mine who rightly, on both sides of the aisle, will point out that reconciliation is supposed to be a budget tool for reconciling the budget and ensuring that we're frankly working to achieve balance and not spending more money than we should. And that very much should be the priority of budget reconciliation, and I will endeavor to ensure that we follow that path. But I want to remind the American people that the reason they cannot afford health care, the reason they cannot go to the doctor of their choice, the reason they are frustrated with the American healthcare system today, the reason insurance companies are making billions of dollars while you suffer, the reason for that is your federal government. It's a federal government that has overpromised, overregulated, and are now telling you precisely what kind of health care you can have while then enriching insurance companies to administer it for you. You can't go to the doctor of your choice. You can't get the health care of your choice. We don't have robust health savings accounts. We haven't empowered you. We've empowered bureaucrats. Bureaucrats in Washington and HHS, bureaucrats at CMS, managing Medicare, managing Medicaid. We've empowered insurance bureaucrats. We've empowered corporate cronies. What we have not done is empowered you. What we have not done is empowered doctors. We must do that if we're going to claim the mantle of not just healthcare freedom and making America healthy again, but if we're going to actually say that we're going to be fiscally responsible. You cannot solve our $36 trillion of debt if you don't solve the burden of healthcare. When we get to January, when we are sworn in, when we have counted the electors for President Trump, when the Senate is in session, we should act with dispatch to pass a reconciliation package right out of the gate that secures the border of the United States. It was the fundamental promise of the Trump campaign, but more importantly, what President Trump has campaigned on all the way back since 2016, what President Trump did while he was in office from 2017 to 2021, and the fundamental failure of the Biden administration to purposely flood our country with some 10 million odd human beings, including criminals, weakening our border, fentanyl, all of the dangers that have been posed to the American people, including the murders of Americans, deaths from fentanyl poisoning, but the burden on our social welfare state and our schools and our jails and our hospitals. So obligation number one for this Republican Congress is to ensure that we secure the border, or at least take step one to secure the border. What will that mean? Well, we need to build the wall. President Trump ran on building the wall in 2016, so let's provide the funding through reconciliation to ensure that the wall is built. But number two, the wall does no good if you have policies in place that allow people to be released into the United States. So that is what the Biden administration has done. So we must fund and empower ICE to carry out the repatriation of millions of individuals who were illegally placed into the United States in violation of law, in violation of statute, in violation of parole, in the name of parole, in the name of asylum. These individuals must be removed and repatriated through funding to ICE and Border Patrol. We need to fund the migrant protection protocols that President Trump was using to ensure that Mexico is upholding its end of the bargain and not dumping people into our country. We need to pay back the states that have had to be on the front lines when the federal government failed us, like Texas, that has spent $12 billion over the last 4 years to stand in the breach. Other states, too, have a claim to having stood up to try to secure the border. We should impose fees, monthly and annual fees, on those who have been paroled into the United States and those that have been given notices to appear in court. Well, we got to pay for all that. Impose fees. Impose fees on application on work permits. Ensure that welfare benefits only go to United States citizens and legal permanent residents, not parolees, not asylees, not people who are illegally present. Currently, that is costing us upwards of $160 billion over 10 years. Yes, your tax dollars are going to fund welfare benefits for people who have been illegally placed into the United States or who illegally came here. Additionally, let's make Mexico and other bad actor states pay for the wall by imposing a tax on remittances sent by non-citizens here abroad. Impose taxes or fees on non-governmental organizations that have been taking taxpayer money just to use against us and move people here illegally into the United States. Require illegal aliens to cover the cost of background checks. Impose fees on aliens that fail to provide approved unexpired identification documents at ports of entry. Increase financial penalties for visa overstays. Increase fees on student visas to stop the foreign takeover of U.S. colleges. Beef up 287G to allow local law enforcement to collaborate with federal law enforcement to enforce our border security and immigration laws. These are just some of the things, pretty exhaustive list, that we can do, should do, and must do right out of the gate in January when we have the pen. We can do it, and by the way, we can pay for it. And we must. Let me be clear. For all manners of our choices on reconciliation, we will pay for them. We will achieve deficit reduction, not deficit increase. That is our calling, and we must achieve it. Failure to do so will not succeed. We can repeal the expanded Internal Revenue Service funding. I'd rather pay for Border Patrol agents than to pay for Internal Revenue Service agents. Some $50 billion sitting there. Let's use that to secure the border of the United States. Let's repeal the student loan policy of the Biden administration, in which Americans that never went to college or have paid off their student loans or don't qualify are paying off the student loans of other Americans. Why? My wife's student loan hasn't been paid off. She's now working on it for 20 years, the product of a single mom. Worked her butt off to go to school, had debt sitting there. She's been paying it down, working hard to pay it down. There are thousands, millions of those people in this country who have followed the law, done their responsibility, worked hard to pay off the student loans. Joe Biden comes in and says, don't worry about that. I'm going to take from you. I'm going to give it to these other people. End that. That could get us between $100 billion and $270 billion. Take that, fund the things we need to do that the Constitution calls for us to do. Repeal the SNAP Thrifty Food Plan. You know what that was? A massive expansion done by the stroke of the pen, just like the same stroke of the pen that Joe Biden used to expand these student loan bailouts, to expand food stamps effectively, and to walk into, let's just continue to fund the worst form. Huge percentages of the food stamps go to sugar drinks and all of the things that are making us unhealthy and making us obese and making us overweight, so that we can then go to pharma and go to big insurance and go to big hospital and say, please save us from ourselves. And the government subsidizes both. The federal government subsidizes the poison. The federal government subsidizes the over-medication. The federal government subsidizes the bureaucracy. And guess what? We're all worse for it. And we're $36 trillion in debt. How about we stop doing that? Every member of Congress is going to have some constituency telling them why they can't do that. You're going to have somebody saying, if you do that, my rural hospital might have a problem. If you do that, my local business, my local sugar growers, my local, manufacturers, who cares? That's not our job. Forgive me to channel Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, but we're not supposed to be here to funnel printed money to our local districts. We're not. That's not why we're elected. Yet, unfortunately, too many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, that's why they're here. Don't do that. We could repeal the EPA EV mandate rule. $113 billion we could save to stop the ridiculous rule to mandate that 2/3 of our fleet turn to electric vehicles by 2032. That is absurd. If you even converted the entire American fleet today to electric vehicles, you would diminish CO2 production by less than, I think, 2%, a fraction. I don't even think it's that high. It would be minimal impact. And you can't even do that. Like, even if we wanted to, we couldn't do that. So why would we drive up the cost of automobiles, make them less reliable, harm the economy, spend money subsidizing something that's not going to produce the result that it said it's going to produce? Also, some people can run around flying to Davos in their private jets, patting themselves on the back, which is precisely what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and gas bags like John Kerry do. I'll probably get admonished for that one. The fact of the matter is, we have an obligation here in Congress to do the job we said we would do. And I give this speech, and I give it pretty regularly, but I'm going to keep giving it. Because I got to be honest with you. This job has its pros and its cons. The cons list tends to stack up. You're away from your family, you're traveling and all of that, but it is a great honor and a great blessing. But one of the great blessings is when you're around the country and you see somebody, or like the woman that I ran into on the street, walking up the street, coming up to the Capitol, who just said thank you. Thank you for fighting for us. Thank you for giving us a voice for sanity. The American people just want their country back. If you want to know what this election was about in November, they just want their country back. They just want common sense back. They just want sanity. And here we are again, sitting here on the eve of passing a National Defense Authorization Act, which my Democrat colleagues, mostly, many of them, are saying they don't want to support because, again, we're limiting the use of taxpayer dollars to go to transgender surgeries for children. So we have a defense authorization bill that's something like, I don't know, $900 billion to authorize the national defense of the United States. I'm just walking through George Washington and all of those men freezing to death, didn't have socks, didn't have shoes, suffering. The General Washington thought he was going to lose the army. Fast forward to Christmas of 1944. And our grandfathers, our great-grandfathers, some of our fathers were sitting in a foxhole in Bastogne, freezing to death. For what? For a country that would take taxpayer dollars to fund through the national defense of the United States the mutilation of children? And my Democrat colleagues want to hold up the National Defense Authorization Act because we dare say that children shouldn't be mutilated? That is the current Democrat Party? You want to know why they were thrown out on their ear in November? That's why. And now we should lead farther. I heard some rumbling on this side of the aisle that the speaker shouldn't have included that language in the bill. The speaker was exactly right to include that language in the bill. We have an obligation in the House of Representatives, the people's house, not to punt. I hear my colleagues saying, well, President Trump will come in, he'll take care of it. I understand that we believe that the policies that will be adopted by the president will be much more to our liking. But what about your constitutional obligation? What about our job? What about our use of the power of the purse? The United States House of Representatives is supposed to be the closest to the people. The people didn't sign up for this. The people just want a military that's lethal again. They just want a military that's not woke, that isn't going through all sorts of nonsense trainings at the academies or at the Pentagon itself. And they sure as hell don't want their taxpayer dollars going to the mutilation of children. Let's not forget that this same National Defense Authorization Act will continue to allow and promote the use of taxpayer dollars for adult transgender surgeries. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, if we pass this bill, this horrible bill, according to our Democratic colleagues, that shouldn't have this provision to protect children, our great win is to pull back the Overton window, pull back the goalpost from full transgender surgeries being funded through your tax dollars through the Pentagon to, well, we'll just do adults but not do children, we think. We'll still fund the chief diversity officer, whatever that is and whatever value that's providing for the Pentagon. We will still continue to authorize all manners of programs. We still have a bill that's larded up with conservation programs and all sorts of things. It's not just a specific defense bill. There are a variety of reasons to oppose this legislation because we can do better. It can be more focused on lethality. It can be with fewer dollars. Our job is to represent the people. It is not to represent the latest focus group at frickin' Yale University that sit around talking about what woke nonsense they want out of our Pentagon. But yet that's what our Democrat colleagues are doing. We'll see what happens tomorrow when we vote on this defense bill. I think it's useful for the American people to see precisely the values of our radical progressive Democrat colleagues on this particular issue. But it is incumbent upon Republicans for us to advance the ball, to shrink the size of government, actually shrink the size of government. Don't hide behind Doge, don't hide behind Elon, don't hide behind Vivek. Don't say, oh, isn't it great? They're going to do all this stuff. They're going to take this stuff in. They're going to use AI. They're going to crowdsource. And then what? What? They're going to present recommendations to secretaries. Secretaries will implement some of that stuff. Meanwhile, Congress will continue to appropriate. Congress will continue to authorize. What will we authorize? What will we appropriate? Will it be responsible? Will we shrink the size of the bureaucracy? Will we make government more efficient and effective and focus on its actual constitutional provisions? Will we address the massive problem with the automatic spending that is Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, now increasingly the Veterans Administration, that is on autopilot? 70% of the budget, 70% of what we spend every year is on autopilot. And we don't touch it. And my Democrat colleagues will say, you're going to push Granny off a cliff. And my Republican colleagues will say, we can't cut discretionary spending because we must focus on so-called mandatory, automatic spending. But then we never have a proposal. We never come to the floor. Now, one of my Democratic colleagues was walking by me earlier. I won't name this individual, lest I get that individual in trouble. And I was given an interview, and they asked me about whether Obamacare subsidies should be on the chopping block for this round of debates on reconciliation later this year in tax policy. Now, my answer, as someone who opposed the implementation of Obamacare, was to not focus on Obamacare. My answer was simple. The American people deserve robust health savings accounts in which they can choose their health care, where they're empowered, their doctors empowered, and insurance companies, bureaucrats, hospitals, and pharma are not empowered. And this Democrat colleague was walking by and said, hey, I can support that. Those are the kinds of conversations, if we want to be serious about driving down the cost of health care so we can actually balance our budget, that we must have in the context of reconciliation. And my message to my Republican colleagues is, if you think you're going to come in this chamber and waltz in here and say that we're going to pass tax reform, extend the tax cuts without dealing with spending, you're mistaken. You're mistaken. If K Street wants to come down here and make their case for all the tax provisions they want, and look, there's a lot of small businesses and people across America who care strongly about getting the tax policies that I agree with that we ought to put in place. Expensing, research and development, pass-through tax policy. But to be very clear, tax policy is not going to move off of the House floor until we deal with spending. We are going to cut spending. We are going to put us on a path to balance. We're going to reduce deficits, or I will be an opponent of tax policy. And many of my colleagues will, because the time is now. No more games, no more gimmicks, no more short-term extensions to get a political win. Both sides of the aisle, this has to end. We get busy, this Congress, figuring out how to be fiscally responsible, dramatically cutting the bureaucracy, shrinking Washington, empowering Americans. I'm reminded, as I wrap up here, signal to my colleagues who are next. I don't know who that is. I don't know if it's a gentlelady from Tennessee or not, but whoever's next. Valley Forge was not the end of the story for this country when I opened up my remarks about General Washington and the suffering of those soldiers under his care and watch. Because those men, freezing, starving, and uncertain of the future, not knowing what laid in front of them, they didn't give up. General Washington wrote in that pre-Christmas letter, and I quote, "We have not more than 3 months to prepare a great deal of business. If we let these slip or waste, we shall be laboring under the same difficulties all next campaign." Washington knew that every low point was a time to prepare, to keep moving, to get things in place for the next fight, because those low points are where opportunity lives. That's what we can learn from and what we have to imitate here. We have 4 years to make transformative change, or we will squander everything that those men at Valley Forge fought for and gave us. All of those men who fought in the Civil War in the 1860s, all of those men who stormed the beaches of Normandy ended up at Bastogne. So what are we going to have written on our headstone when this fight is over? Did we keep and preserve this republic for our kids and our grandkids? That should be the question that guides everything we do as Republicans in charge of this House chamber going forward. With that, Mr. Speaker, I would yield back the balance of my time.